Image of the Fendahl is another pretty good story in Graham Williams' era as producer, dealing with some much darker elements than we had seen in The Invisible Enemy. I'm finding it somewhat difficult to put my finger on what this era is really going for, because one week it'll feel like a classic Hinchcliffe story, then you'll have an utterly ridiculous and silly serial that is just a lot of fun, and here you have something else. I do like seeing the show try different and interesting things, and I am by no means saying that every serial should feel the same, but it is just a little bit hard to figure out what exactly the show is trying to be right now. Basically, everything about this story on paper is something that I should really like. You have some very dark and creepy alien elements that feel like they are coming from the previous era, but the way that they are all executed results in a product that feels somewhat flavorless and uninteresting. I don't want to give too much away about this story and what it is doing, but it's the kind of thing that I would ordinarily have a lot of fun with. The Daemons is an example of a story that I love, and it feels like it is constantly doing things with its concepts and really having fun with them. This one, on the other hand, it just kind of feels like an average Doctor Who story. The actual threat of the serial has very little influence on its style, at least that's how I felt. And even though this one goes rather dark in places, the approach to these decisions within the actual story just felt very uninspired. And don't get me wrong, I did legitimately enjoy this serial. I liked the introduction to what was going on, I thought there was some good directing in places, and the story sparingly made use of some great atmosphere with a couple of night sequences. Our main characters are largely good, but at the same time, there was really nothing about this one that made it feel special in any way. It just felt like a pretty standard entry for the show, an enjoyable entry, but quite standard nonetheless. And as the serial progressed, I did find myself less and less interested in the events of the story. The setup was solid, but by the time we got to the end, I was honestly ready for it to be over. And I did enjoy each part of this story, but I increasingly found less and less for me to like within them. The supporting characters are perfectly fine in this one. They didn't really add much to my viewing experience, and they did serve a purpose within the story and worked for how they were needed. I didn't take much issue with them. Some of them were more mixed than others, and on the whole they worked fine. I do enjoy our main characters as always. The Doctor is quite solid as one of our leads, and Leela works rather well with him. They're not really my favorite TARDIS duo, but I do appreciate the uniqueness of these characters together, and I like how Leela does bring something new to the table as a companion, and I like seeing what she brings out of the Doctor. One thing I'm noticing is that though I am still really liking the Doctor, I can't help but feel that Sarah Jane understandably brought out a bit more of an enjoyable side to the character, whereas in the past season there hasn't been as much of that from the Doctor ever since she left. As said, I do like seeing something different in terms of the Doctor's relationship to his companion, but I also do think it's worth acknowledging that I did prefer the character when he was with Sarah Jane, because I think it did bring out more from him in terms of entertainment and chemistry in the Doctor-companion dynamic than we have gotten with him and Leela. Also, K9 doesn't really get to do anything within this story, which is a bit of a shame as I do quite like him, but I understand that he isn't going to be too heavily involved in a lot of stories because of difficulties in using the prop, particularly on location, so I understand why he is left in the TARDIS, but I do hope we see more of him later in the season. At this point, I will have to give you a spoiler warning for this serial. If you have not seen this one, then please skip to the time as shown on screen, and for everyone else, let us continue in discussing the image of Fendahl. So I do want to further illustrate the point I talked about earlier about this story having some darker elements on paper that are executed in what was to me a somewhat bland and uninteresting way. Like, this scene of the guy shooting himself in the head should be really dark because it is such a grim fate for a person to meet, but the way that it is portrayed on screen is just something that happens. He shot himself, the episode moves on. It doesn't really matter all that much, and stylistically it's just kind of bland to me. I am finding this particularly hard to express, but effectively most of the things in this story that could have worked quite well as dark and creepy scenes were approached in a way that left me uninterested, and I found them to be rather stylistically unmemorable, though the story was still largely engaging. And that said, the episode did have its moments of inspiration and intrigue, but they were rather sparing. And one thing I would like to be clear on is that I didn't take issue with the fact that this story wasn't a super dark story that really creeped me out. It's really just that I wasn't that interested in what they did with the elements they chose to play with. There are some ways that I could see them going with them that I would be more interested in, but the way that they are presented just doesn't captivate me or engage me as much as you would like from a Doctor Who story. It's not about something specific that I wish they had done, it's just that I felt the way they went about this one wasn't the most interesting of approaches. The actual main villain in this story was fine. It really ties into all these things I've already brought up about having something that is seemingly quite dark in concept that is approached in a somewhat bland way. There's a disconnect between those two things that just doesn't quite fit. I still think that it worked perfectly fine though, and there was a reasonably good progression from the introduction of the idea of what this villain is to the actual villain as it is presented on screen, though it was far from the most memorable of foes the Doctor has faced. The main thing I just felt like I needed to mention in this review is this incredibly odd ending note that the story leaves you with. I might get hit with a copyright strike for showing you so much interrupted footage, but just look at how strange this whole scene is.
Well, it's about K9? K9, yes. I'd better finish repairing him.
You called him him. You called him him!
I can call K9 him if I want to. He's my dog. Aren't you, K9?
This entire scene confuses me on so many levels, from what it's trying to accomplish, to the Doctor not finishing his sentence, to the way it shifts between all of these different beats, to how K9 continually nods his head several times in a row. I think it might be an attempt at a comedic end to a story, but the pacing of the whole thing is so off that it just completely fails to do that. It's really just a strange end to what was a pretty good episode. Getting here to pretty much the end of the review, I can't help but feel that I did come across a little bit too negatively in this one from my actual feelings on the story, because I did actually enjoy the story, but I think that's down to me trying to pinpoint why this one didn't work better for me, because it feels like an episode that I should really like, and ultimately I think it's just an enjoyable one. So I want to reiterate here that even though all of these things aren't quite fitting in the way that I feel like they could in order to be a better story, it was still captivating enough and entertaining to watch the Doctor and Leela go on this adventure. I enjoyed my time with this one, even if I have spent a good portion of this review expressing the ways in which I think it didn't quite succeed, but I think it's important to note that I do like this story and I had a good time with it, even if it wasn't quite as strong as I would have liked. Overall, I enjoyed this episode for what it was, though I did find it was lacking in places and had a largely quite bland style and presentation, with some stronger parts throughout. The Doctor and Leela are good in this story and are enjoyable leads to follow throughout the narrative. I found this to be a pretty good serial, and I'm going to give The Image of Fendahl a rating of 7.5 out of 10. And that's going to do it for now, folks. Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are on this story down below. I will be interested in what you have to say if you feel like sharing, and I hope to see you around soon, possibly in 1 week's time on Sunday, or possibly a Sunday in the future for my review of The Sunmakers, whenever that video ends up being released. But if not, that's completely fine by me, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.